In 1933, the United States looked at the Soviet Union and saw a regime built on an ideology it had spent 15 years refusing to even recognize. By 1945, that same Soviet Union was America's essential partner in crushing Nazi Germany. By 1991, it was gone, collapsed, dissolved, erased from the map in the span of a single Christmas week. And by 2022, the relationship between Washington and Moscow had curdled into the coldest confrontation since the Cuban Missile Crisis. How did two nations swing this violently between alliance, rivalry, fragile hope, and open hostility, not once, but 3 or 4 times across a single century? This is the story of the most consequential, most volatile, and most misunderstood bilateral relationship of the modern age. I have solid grounding for Chapter 1. I'll now write the full chapter using this research, in documentary style, and continue with the remaining chapters using my own well-established historical knowledge, World War II alliance, Cold War, post-Soviet relations, verifying any uncertain specifics as needed. When the United States and Russia first looked at each other across the table as modern nation-states, the relationship that would define so much of the 20th century did not begin with hostility, it began with silence. For more than a century before 1917, the Russian Empire and the United States had maintained a surprisingly cordial relationship. Russia had quietly supported the Union during the American Civil War, sending naval squadrons to New York and San Francisco in a gesture widely interpreted as a warning to Britain and France against intervening on the Confederacy's behalf. The two empires, vast, expanding, and geographically distant enough to avoid direct conflict, had coexisted for generations without the friction that defined Russia's relations with Britain or France. That world ended in 1917. When the February Revolution toppled Tsar Nicholas II, Washington reacted with genuine enthusiasm. The American ambassador in Petrograd, David R. Francis, rushed a request back to Washington asking for swift recognition of the new provisional government, framing the revolution as a vindication of democratic government by consent of the governed. The United States became the first foreign government to formally recognize the new government, just days after the Tsar's abdication. For a brief moment, American officials allowed themselves to believe that Russia was on the verge of becoming a Western-style constitutional democracy, a natural ally in the war against Germany. That illusion did not survive the year. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution, and everything Washington had hoped for collapsed. In wake of the revolution, Wilson withheld recognition because the newly installed government refused to honor prior debts to the United States incurred by the overthrown Tsarist government, ignored pre-existing treaty agreements with other nations, and seized American property. Compounding American outrage, the Bolsheviks negotiated a separate peace with Germany at Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, pulling Russia out of the First World War entirely and freeing German divisions to redeploy against the Western Front, an act many in Washington and London viewed as a betrayal of the alliance. What followed was a chapter of American-Russian relations rarely discussed in textbooks: direct, if limited, U.S. military intervention against the Bolsheviks. American troops landed at Archangel in the north and Vladivostok in the far east, ostensibly to protect military stockpiles and assist the evacuation of Czech Legion forces, but in practice becoming entangled in the Russian Civil War on the side of anti-Bolshevik forces. It was a strange, half-declared conflict, never popular at home, and it left a scar in Soviet historical memory that would be invoked for decades, proof, in the Soviet telling, that the capitalist West had tried to strangle the revolution in its cradle. By 1920, American troops had withdrawn, but the diplomatic wall remained. The United States refused to recognize the Soviet government at all. No ambassadors, no embassies, no formal communication between Washington and Moscow, for 16 years. This was not because the rest of the world followed America's lead. Britain, France, Germany, and Italy had all extended recognition to Moscow during the 1920s. The United States stood almost alone among major powers in its refusal, a position rooted in ideological revulsion at communism, anger over repudiated debts, and lingering resentment over expropriated American property. Yet isolation was never absolute. Even without diplomatic relations, American commerce found its way into the Soviet experiment. Henry Ford's tractor designs and manufacturing techniques flowed into Soviet industrialization projects. American engineers consulted on Soviet dam construction. The contradiction was glaring and very American. Washington refused to shake Moscow's hand while American companies cashed Moscow's checks. This commercial relationship without diplomacy shaped much of the decade, even as the lack of formal ties limited the broader scope of bilateral engagement. H-net. By the early 1930s, the pressures pushing toward recognition were mounting on both sides. The Soviet market, expanding under the first five-year plan, offered a much-needed outlet for the surpluses of depression-ridden American industry, and business and financial circles urged Washington to reevaluate its Russian policy. The Great Depression had devastated American agricultural and industrial exports, and the Soviet Union, hungry for foreign machinery and technical expertise, represented an enormous untapped market. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japan's increasingly aggressive posture in Manchuria gave both Washington and Moscow a shared strategic concern that began to outweigh their ideological differences. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, newly inaugurated in March 1933, saw an opportunity. Roosevelt hoped that recognition of the Soviet Union would serve U.S. strategic interests by limiting Japanese expansionism in Asia, and he believed that full diplomatic recognition would serve American commercial interests in the Soviet Union, a matter of some concern to an administration grappling with the effects of the Great Depression. There was also a simpler calculus at work. By 1933, the United States was the only major power on Earth that still refused to recognize the Soviet government. The policy had become, in practical terms, an exercise in diplomatic futility. U.S. Department of State. Roosevelt moved with characteristic informality, bypassing the State Department entirely. He commissioned a survey of public opinion, polling newspaper editors, of whom 63% favored recognition of the USSR while only 27% opposed it. He personally met with Catholic leaders to address their concerns about Soviet religious persecution. And he dispatched two trusted intermediaries, Treasury official Henry Morgenthau and diplomat William Bullitt, to begin quiet negotiations with the Soviet Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Maxim Litvinov. The talks in Washington in November 1933 were not smooth. Initial negotiations made little headway due to several outstanding issues: the unpaid debt owed by the Soviet Union to the United States, the restriction of religious freedoms and legal rights of U.S. citizens living in the Soviet Union, and Soviet involvement in communist subversion and propaganda within the United States. But Roosevelt and Litvinov, working through a series of personal, one-on-one conversations that have since become known to historians as the Roosevelt-Litvinov conversations, found enough common ground to proceed. The Soviets promised not to interfere in internal American affairs and to ensure that no organization in the USSR worked to overthrow the U.S. government by force, promises that would not be honored, while both sides agreed to postpone the debt question to a later date. U.S. Department of State Wikipedia. On November 16, 1933, Roosevelt announced the resumption of normal diplomatic relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. 16 years of estrangement had ended. There were few complaints about the move at the time. But the optimism evaporated almost immediately. William Bullitt, appointed as the first American ambassador to Moscow, arrived in the Soviet capital in December 1933 brimming with hope for a genuine partnership. Bullitt arrived in Moscow with high hopes for Soviet-American relations, but his view of the Soviet leadership soured on closer inspection due to the regime's totalitarian nature and terror, and by the end of his tenure he had become openly hostile to the Soviet government, remaining an outspoken anti-communist for the rest of his life. The debt issue, which both sides had hoped to resolve through goodwill, instead became the most unfortunate and most productive source of future discord, poisoned by ambiguous terms and mutual bad faith. And then came Kirov. In December 1934, the assassination of Leningrad Communist Party boss Sergei Kirov became the pretext for the launch of Stalin's Great Purges, a campaign of terror that would eventually consume millions of Soviet lives. The toughening of political repressions after the assassination of Kirov, and the increasingly repressive character of Soviet state policy, horrified many diplomats stationed in Moscow, transforming American sympathy into open alarm. The cruel irony of 1933 was this: the very act that finally normalized relations between Washington and Moscow also opened American eyes, for the first time at close range, to the true nature of the system they were now dealing with. Trade agreements were eventually signed in 1935. Cultural exchanges trickled forward. But the deep mutual suspicion that would define the entire Cold War era was already taking root, years before that war had a name. By the late 1930s, as Hitler's Germany expanded across Europe and Stalin signed his stunning non-aggression pact with the Nazis in August 1939, American-Soviet relations sank to a new low. The Soviet invasions of Finland, the Baltic states, and eastern Poland appalled American opinion and led to the USSR's expulsion from the League of Nations. Few in Washington or Moscow, watching the world descend into war, could have imagined that within 2 years, these two estranged and mutually suspicious powers would become each other's indispensable wartime allies, bound together not by shared values, but by the relentless, unifying logic of a common enemy. When Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, he unintentionally created the strangest great power alliance of the modern era, a partnership between a capitalist republic and a communist dictatorship, bound together by nothing more than a shared enemy. Just 2 years earlier, such an alliance would have seemed impossible. U.S.-Soviet relations had soured significantly following Stalin's decision to sign a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in August of 1939, and the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland and the brutal Winter War against Finland led Roosevelt to publicly condemn the Soviet Union as a dictatorship as absolute as any other in the world. Washington had responded with a moral embargo restricting trade with Moscow. As far as the American public was concerned, Stalin's Soviet Union was, for those 2 years, functionally aligned with Hitler's Germany. Then came Barbarossa, and everything changed overnight. The War Department in Washington, deeply skeptical of Soviet staying power, warned Roosevelt that the Red Army would collapse within 6 weeks. Roosevelt nonetheless dispatched his trusted aide Harry Hopkins to Moscow to assess the situation directly, and after meeting personally with Stalin, Hopkins returned convinced that the Soviets could hold and urged Roosevelt to provide assistance. By the end of October 1941, the first shipments of American Lend-Lease aid were already crossing the ocean toward Soviet ports. The numbers involved were staggering. Roughly $11 billion in war material flowed from the United States to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, transported through three main routes: the Persian Gulf corridor through Iran, which carried about 70% of the total, along with shipments across the Pacific to Vladivostok and across the North Atlantic to the brutal Arctic convoys bound for Murmansk. The hardware was staggering in scope: more than 400,000 jeeps and trucks, 12,000 armored vehicles including 7,000 tanks, and over 11,000 aircraft, alongside 1.75 million tons of food. The significance of this aid remains one of the most contested questions in the historiography of the war. Soviet wartime propaganda, and much of post-war Soviet historical writing, minimized the Western contribution almost to the point of erasure. After VE Day and continuing into the Cold War, many Soviet historians downplayed the importance of the Western powers' contribution, with the large quantities of material aid from America's arsenal of democracy largely dismissed in official Soviet histories. The reality, as historians now generally agree, was more nuanced. The Red Army won its existential battles at Moscow and Stalingrad essentially on its own, relying on Soviet industry hastily relocated beyond the Ural Mountains. But Lend-Lease provided critical supplies precisely when the Soviet Union was at a tipping point, helping fill the gap between the relocation of factories eastward and the resumption of full domestic production. The National World War II Museum. The National World War II Museum. It was not merely a wartime favor. Stalin himself, addressing the matter privately at the 1945 Yalta Conference, was uncharacteristically generous in his assessment, calling Lend-Lease one of Franklin Roosevelt's most remarkable and vital achievements in the formation of the alliance, though he never made this admission to his own people. LOC. The wartime relationship was never one of full transparency or genuine trust. It was an alliance of necessity, conducted at arm's length. Operational cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union was notably less close than that between the other Allied powers, with the Eastern Front and the Western Front fought, in practice, as two largely separate wars connected mainly by shared strategic timing and the regular, often tense, summit diplomacy of the Big Three. That diplomacy unfolded across a sequence of increasingly consequential conferences: Tehran in late 1943, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin secured confirmation on the launching of the cross-channel invasion and a promise from Stalin that the Soviet Union would eventually enter the war against Japan. And then, most fatefully, Yalta in February 1945. Yalta has become, in the decades since, a byword for both diplomatic triumph and diplomatic naivety. Meeting at the former Tsar's summer palace in the Crimea, Churchill and an ailing Roosevelt, recognizing the overwhelming strength of the Soviet army already occupying most of Eastern Europe, agreed to a series of compromises with Stalin that allowed Soviet hegemony to remain in Poland and other Eastern European countries, granted the USSR territorial concessions, and outlined the framework for the post-war occupation of Germany. The conference's centerpiece promise, free elections throughout liberated Europe, would prove to be its most fatal ambiguity. The Declaration on Liberated Europe promised free elections but used vague language that Stalin and the West would soon interpret in starkly different ways. Roosevelt did not live to see how that ambiguity would resolve. He died in April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, leaving the management of the alliance's unraveling to a stunningly inexperienced successor. Harry Truman had served as vice president for only 82 days before becoming president, and he met Stalin for the first time only months later, at the Potsdam Conference. At Potsdam, in the ruins of a defeated Germany, the cracks that had been merely cosmetic at Yalta widened into structural fractures. Notably, The Soviet Union already knew about the existence of the atomic bomb through espionage before Truman ever mentioned it to Stalin face-to-face at the conference, a small but telling detail of just how compromised mutual trust had already become, even before the guns fell silent. What followed was not a sudden break but a swift unraveling. As the Soviet-American alliance against the Axis came to an end following the Allied victory in 1945, the first signs of post-war mistrust and hostility began to immediately appear between the two countries, as the Soviet Union militarily occupied Eastern European countries and turned them into satellite states, forming what would soon be called the Eastern Bloc. Winston Churchill, no longer in office but still possessing enormous moral authority, gave the rupture its enduring metaphor. Churchill had actually sent Truman a private memo warning of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe in May 1945, a full 10 months before he used the phrase publicly in his famous Fulton, Missouri speech of March 1946. By that point, American diplomats stationed in Moscow had already begun reframing the entire relationship. George Kennan, a State Department official in the U.S. Embassy, sent a cable back to Washington in February 1946 that would become legendary for both its length and its influence, the so-called long telegram, running 5,540 words, so lengthy that it had to be transmitted in multiple parts and reportedly irritated the State Department's own telegraph staff. Kennan's analysis, arguing that Soviet expansionism was rooted in deep historical insecurity and ideological conviction rather than any specific grievance that negotiation could resolve, became the intellectual foundation for an entirely new American strategy: containment. The final, formal break came in March 1947. The immediate trigger was Britain's announcement that it could no longer continue financial and military aid to Greece, where a civil war was raging against communist insurgents, an announcement made just 3 weeks before Truman went to Congress. On March 12, 1947, President Truman asked Congress for aid to Greece and Turkey, framing the request in sweeping ideological terms. The world, he argued, was now divided between free peoples and those threatened by authoritarian regimes. This protracted geopolitical, ideological, and economic struggle, lasting from the announcement of the Truman Doctrine in March 1947 until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991, would become known to history as the Cold War, a confrontation that persisted for nearly 45 years. In just 2 years, from February 1945 to March 1947, the United States and the Soviet Union had transformed from partners in victory into leaders of opposing global blocs. The wartime alliance, remarkable as it had been, turned out to be a brief and fragile interlude. The two powers had been allies for only 3 years and 9 months, a shorter span than the nearly half-century of confrontation that would follow. The world that emerged from the ashes of the Second World War was not the cooperative order Roosevelt had hoped to build at Yalta. It was something far more dangerous: 2 nuclear-armed superpowers, each convinced of its own righteousness, locked into a rivalry that would shape the fate of nations across every continent for 2 generations to come. For 4.5 decades, the relationship between Washington and Moscow would be defined by a single, terrifying innovation in human affairs: a war that could never actually be fought, between 2 powers who nonetheless behaved, in every other respect, exactly as if they were at war. The early architecture of confrontation went up fast. When the Soviets blockaded West Berlin in 1948, the United States responded with a massive airlift of food and fuel that continued until September 1949, ultimately delivering 2.3 million tons of supplies to the besieged city, a demonstration that Washington would defend its position in Central Europe without firing a shot. By 1949, the USSR had installed satellite governments across Eastern Europe and North Korea, cementing the political division of the continent, while in Asia, the Korean War of 1950 to 1953 became the Cold War's first major proxy conflict, ending in stalemate. Then, in August 1949, came the moment that transformed the entire character of the rivalry. Aided by information stolen from the Manhattan Project by Soviet spies, the USSR successfully tested a 20-kiloton atomic bomb years ahead of American predictions, ending the United States' nuclear monopoly and igniting the arms race between the two superpowers. The American response came 3 years later. On November 1, 1952, the United States tested its first hydrogen bomb at Eniwetok Atoll in the Marshall Islands, a weapon of a destructive order of magnitude beyond anything used in the Second World War. Stalin's death in 1953 brought only a partial thaw. The USSR formalized its network of Eastern European alliances into the Warsaw Pact in 1955, standing opposed to NATO, and when Hungarians rose up against Soviet domination the following year, the Soviet suppression of the revolt demonstrated the firm limits of any liberalization within the Soviet bloc. Briefly, in the late 1950s, there were genuine signs of a different path. An upswing in diplomacy in 1959 included a 2-week visit by Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to the United States and plans for a two-power summit in May 1960, hopes that collapsed almost instantly when an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Soviet territory, catching President Eisenhower in a public lie about the nature of the surveillance flights. Nothing, however, compared to October 1962. For 13 days, the world watched a direct confrontation unfold after American nuclear missile deployments in the United Kingdom, Italy, and Turkey were matched by Soviet deployments of nuclear missiles in Cuba, a crisis widely considered the closest the Cold War ever came to escalating into full-scale nuclear war. The resolution, achieved through secret back-channel diplomacy, left both sides badly shaken. In its aftermath, the two superpowers established a direct teletype communication link between Washington and Moscow, popularly known as the hotline, specifically to reduce the risk of catastrophic misunderstanding in any future crisis. The missile crisis became, paradoxically, the foundation for the most productive period of Cold War diplomacy. Shaken by the near miss with nuclear catastrophe, both sides moved with unusual speed to constrain the arms race, producing a dense sequence of agreements over the following decade: the hotline itself, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, the Nonproliferation Treaty of 1968, the Strategic Arms Limitation talks beginning in 1969, and the Nixon-Brezhnev-Moscow Summit of 1972 that crowned the high point of détente. The principle of mutual assured destruction, the recognition that any full nuclear exchange would annihilate both societies regardless of who struck first, had become, in the most unsettling possible way, the stabilizing logic of the entire system. Détente did not last. By 1979, the toppling of American allied governments in Iran and Nicaragua, combined with the outbreak of the Soviet-Afghan War, sharply raised tensions once again. Ronald Reagan, entering office in 1981, abandoned the conciliatory language of his immediate predecessors. In March 1983, Reagan gave a speech referring to the Soviet Union as an evil empire and warning against any appeasement, and weeks later he announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a proposed space-based shield against Soviet missiles that critics warned would violate existing arms control treaties. By November 1983, in the midst of heightened NATO exercises that the Kremlin misread as preparations for a real attack, the world may have come closer to nuclear war than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis, a moment of danger almost entirely invisible to the public at the time. The transformation that followed was as sudden as it was unexpected, and it hinged almost entirely on the appearance of a single, very different kind of Soviet leader. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the USSR and began expanding political freedoms through the twin policies of glasnost and perestroika. Reagan, despite his hardline rhetoric, proved unexpectedly willing to meet him. Reagan's approach was to look for areas of common interest, to be candid about points of contention, and to support Gorbachev's reforms while deliberately avoiding any demand for regime change, a notably different posture from the containment-focused caution of his Cold War predecessors. The results came quickly. In 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan signed the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, agreeing to eliminate their country's entire arsenals of ground-launched, mid-range nuclear missiles by 1991, the first agreement in history to actually reduce nuclear arms, rather than merely cap them, complete with comprehensive verification measures. Standing at the Berlin Wall that same June, Reagan delivered the line that would define the decade's closing act: "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Less than 18 months later, the wall came down anyway, not by superpower decree, but by the sheer momentum of popular revolt. U.S.-Soviet disarmament talks accelerated rapidly after the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, an event widely seen as marking the beginning of the end of the Cold War in Europe. Riding that same wave of unrest, the communist leadership of every Eastern European nation except Bulgaria was overthrown by popular uprising before the end of 1989. The following year, East and West Germany reunified as a single state that retained its NATO membership, an outcome that, only a decade earlier, would have seemed almost unimaginable to leaders on either side of the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union itself had only months left to live. In July 1991, with the collapse of the USSR just months away, President George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev signed the START Treaty, under which both sides, each possessing more than 10,000 deployed nuclear warheads in 1990, pledged to reduce their arsenals to well below 6,000. It was the final great act of superpower arms control between the two Cold War rivals as such. Gorbachev survived several attempted coups against him that year, but on December 8, 1991, the Soviet Union finally collapsed, and Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic, formed the Commonwealth of Independent States in its place. 45 years of confrontation, measured, by most historians' reckoning, from the Truman Doctrine to the Soviet collapse, had ended not in war, but in exhaustion, reform, and the quiet implosion of one half of the equation. The Cold War was over. But the question of what would replace it, whether partnership, indifference, or a new and different kind of rivalry, was about to be answered in ways nobody in Washington or Moscow fully anticipated. Now I have what I need to bring the story to the present moment responsibly. Writing the final chapter. When the Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin for the last time in December 1991, many in Washington allowed themselves a rare moment of historical optimism. Perhaps, after 74 years of revolution, war, and rivalry, the United States and Russia could simply become normal countries to one another. For a few years, that optimism seemed almost justified. In the early years of Boris Yeltsin's presidency, the United States and Russia established a genuinely cooperative relationship, working closely together on arms control, counterterrorism, and the conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The personal chemistry between leaders mattered enormously in this period. The personal diplomacy between President Clinton and Yeltsin yielded half a dozen major understandings that either resolved or alleviated disputes over Russia's role in the post-Cold War world, agreements covering everything from halting Russian rocket technology sales to India, to removing Soviet-era nuclear weapons from Ukraine in exchange for security assurances, to institutionalizing cooperation between Russia and an expanding NATO. That last point, NATO's expansion, would prove to be the single most consequential and contested issue in the entire post-Cold War relationship. Even in the dissolution's earliest hours, Russian leaders had imagined a different future for themselves within the Western security architecture. On December 21, 1991, Boris Yeltsin sent a letter to NATO asking it to consider accepting Russia as a member of the alliance at some point in the future. Nothing came of it. Instead, over the following decade, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic became NATO members in 1999, the first wave of an eastward expansion that would eventually bring the alliance directly to Russia's borders. Yeltsin criticized this expansion as a threat to Russian security, even as, according to many historians, he ultimately acquiesced to the first round in 1997 because he judged his personal relationship with Clinton not worth sacrificing over what he then considered a comparatively smaller matter. The question of whether Western officials had made informal promises in 1990 not to expand NATO eastward remains one of the most disputed points in the entire post-Cold War historical record. The view that such informal assurances were given to the Soviet Union is common in Russia, and according to political scientist Mark Trachtenberg, the available evidence suggests these Russian allegations were by no means baseless. Whatever the precise truth of those 1990 conversations, the perception of betrayal became, for Russian leaders across 3 decades, a recurring grievance, one that would be invoked again and again as relations deteriorated. The new millennium opened with fresh hope. Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer who had risen to acting president following Yeltsin's resignation, was elected to his first full term in March 2000. Putin initially sought to improve relations with the United States, and the two countries cooperated closely on counterterrorism and arms control. Putin even floated, in a 2000 interview, the idea of Russia someday joining NATO outright. Following the September 11 attacks, Putin worked closely with President George W. Bush on the war in Afghanistan, a level of cooperation that briefly suggested the old Cold War categories might genuinely be dissolving. They were not. Throughout the 2000s, a series of popular uprisings against post-Soviet authoritarian and semi-authoritarian governments, what came to be known as the color revolutions, reshaped Putin's view of American intentions. Putin came to believe Russian national interests were threatened by what he portrayed as US-supported coups, and after each one, Serbia in 2000, Georgia in 2003, Ukraine in 2004, he pivoted toward more hostile policies, repeatedly invoking the NATO threat as justification. For Putin personally, Ukraine's 2004 political tilt toward the West marked a far more significant negative turning point than even the formal NATO expansion completed that same year, a telling signal of just how central Ukraine, specifically, had become to Russian strategic thinking. In 2007, Putin made his concerns explicit and public. In a speech in Munich, Putin condemned the eastward enlargement of NATO, and the following year, Russia invaded Georgia. That same year, President Bush promised Ukraine and Georgia that they would one day join NATO, a major point of contention that contributed to an often antagonistic relationship between Putin and Bush's successor, Barack Obama. The pattern that would define the following decade was now set. In 2011, Putin accused the United States of interfering in Russian parliamentary elections and encouraging the anti-government protests that followed, the largest demonstrations Russia had seen since the Soviet collapse itself. Brief moments of cooperation persisted alongside the growing friction. The new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, signed in 2010, reduced both nations' stockpiles of nuclear missile launch platforms even as political trust continued to erode. Then came 2014, the year that historians increasingly identify as the true hinge point of the post-Cold War relationship. After the Euromaidan protest movement overthrew Ukraine's pro-Russian government, Russia illegally annexed Crimea and fomented conflict in eastern Ukraine's Donbass region. Relations between the two countries became significantly strained as a result, and international sanctions imposed against Russia beginning that year would later be dramatically expanded. NATO responded by suspending cooperation with Russia, and many member states imposed sanctions, while a small NATO tripwire force was deployed to the Baltic states and Poland. Some political analysts began describing this period as the beginning of a second Cold War. The 2016 American presidential election added an entirely new and bitter dimension to the relationship. Allegations of Russian interference in that election further strained ties, leading to additional sanctions and diplomatic expulsions. Meanwhile, Russia's military intervention in the Syrian civil war compounded the deterioration already underway. By the early 2020s, the relationship had entered a genuinely dangerous phase. In 2021, Russia massed troops on Ukraine's borders, and that October, NATO expelled 8 Russian officials from its headquarters over alleged spying, prompting Russia to suspend its NATO mission and close the alliance's Moscow office. Putin claimed, falsely, that NATO was building up military infrastructure inside Ukraine in preparation for an attack on Russia. That December, Russia issued sweeping demands to NATO, including a full withdrawal of forces from Eastern Europe. The alliance rejected some demands while offering to negotiate others if Russia halted its military buildup. The diplomacy failed. Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, beginning the largest war in Europe since the Second World War and causing a complete breakdown of NATO-Russia relations. The United States sent weapons and military aid to Ukraine, increased its troop presence in bordering NATO countries, and imposed sweeping new sanctions on Russian financial institutions, while freezing trillions of dollars in Russian state assets. Putin, who viewed himself in the historical tradition of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great as a gatherer of Russian lands, framed the invasion as the first step toward a broader restoration of territories he believed had been wrongly severed from Russia by Western machinations after 1991. The diplomatic and strategic infrastructure painstakingly built since the Cuban Missile Crisis began, alarmingly, to disappear. Regular bilateral discussions on arms control, nuclear weapons, and strategic stability, a mainstay of the relationship dating back to the 1972 Salt Treaty, effectively vanished, with Russia refusing to discuss any replacement for the New START treaty until the United States ceased supporting Ukraine. Strategically isolated from much of the West, Russia found a critical lifeline elsewhere. China had already emerged as Moscow's key partner even before the invasion, and Russian-Chinese economic and military ties strengthened considerably further in its aftermath, as Russia grew increasingly dependent on China under the weight of sustained sanctions. The most recent chapter remains, quite literally, still being written. Since the beginning of the second Trump administration, the United States has pursued a policy of normalization and improved relations with Russia, centered largely on resolving the invasion of Ukraine. Diplomatic efforts through 2025 produced uneven results. Talks held in Saudi Arabia in early 2025 reached agreements on an energy infrastructure strike moratorium and progress toward a Black Sea maritime ceasefire, though Russia subsequently outlined demands for sanctions relief as a precondition for the maritime element taking effect. And President Zelensky accused Putin of surrounding ceasefire proposals with preconditions designed to ensure they either failed or dragged on indefinitely. Hopes that the conflict could be ended swiftly have faded considerably since. The broader geopolitical landscape, meanwhile, continues to shift in ways that would have seemed unthinkable even a few years ago. During the Greenland crisis of January 2026, after President Trump threatened to annex Greenland from NATO member Denmark and to impose tariffs on allies opposing him, Russia openly welcomed the episode as evidence that the transatlantic alliance was collapsing, with Russian state media praising the pressure it placed on relations between the United States and Europe. More than a century after a Bolshevik government first severed ties with Washington in the chaos of 1917, the relationship between these two nations remains exactly what it has almost always been, not a fixed enmity, and not a stable friendship, but a relationship that swings, again and again, between cooperation born of necessity and confrontation born of fundamentally different visions of the world order each side believes it is entitled to shape. Both nations have, at various points, considered one another foreign adversaries for much of their shared history, even while maintaining genuine cooperation in areas like nuclear safety, non-proliferation, counterterrorism, and space exploration. Whether the current moment becomes a fourth great thaw, or simply another uneasy pause before the next rupture, is a question that, as has so often been true in this relationship, only history itself will be able to answer.